All right, welcome back on to Chapter 3, Preparation for Training. This chapter strikes me as a little bit of an outlier, at least thematically, with a lot of the rest of the stuff that we've talked about. And I say that in that it seems like it's written more towards sport coaching, as it spends a lot of its time talking about technical training and tactical training, and that it's not as much of a strength and conditioning focus. Now, I guess that said, obviously our strength and conditioning work is going to have to mesh together with what it is that they're doing for their sporting activities. So if they're spending a bunch of time on technical training and tactical training, well, that's time in the day that they're not going to spend on strength and conditioning, and that's also added stress, potentially added fatigue for the athlete, and so that will then affect how much load they can withstand from a strength and conditioning standpoint. So as far as preparation for training goes, so one of the things that the authors go to great effort to highlight here is this idea that physical training is the foundation on which all other training factors are developed. And they're right. So for example, if you've got a football quarterback who improves their arm strength, then that will hopefully enable them to be better at the technical skills of their sport. So now they can throw longer passes, which enables them to do different tactical skills, right? So you can run a different set of plays if you can throw the ball a little bit farther. I think viewed another way is that if somebody is lacking in some of those biomotor abilities, so if somebody is lacking in strength, they're just not going to be able to do certain things. So for example, an athlete who is particularly weak in the lower body is not going to be able to make really sharp, strong cuts. They're not going to be able to change direction very well. They're obviously not going to be as fast, those kinds of things. So if we develop that physical foundation, that they have a certain amount of muscular strength, muscular endurance, cardiovascular endurance, etc., then we build on that base, as you can see with this sweet pyramid diagram. We're going to build on that base. If they have the requisite strength, then they can perform the technical training, so then they can do the actual movements involved with their sport, whether again that's change of direction, skating, throwing, those kinds of things. And then based on what they can do as far as the technical aspects, again, how far they can throw, how accurately they can throw, that affects what we can do tactically, or what the coaches can do tactically. And then the top of the pyramid, the thing that occupies the dessert component of the triangle in the old food and nutrition pyramid, that on this pyramid is psychological and mental training. So once they're able to perform the tactics, now we have to hone their abilities to understand when to implement those tactics. So for example, if we're sticking with my football analogy here, if we're thinking about an athlete who knows the plays, in terms of building on those tactics, and that the way that we would incorporate mental training there is they then have to know, okay, based on the coverage that the defense is running, I would want to check out of this play and switch to another play that's more likely to be effective, right? So which of those factors we're going to emphasize, whether it's physical training, technical training, tactical training, etc., which of those we're going to emphasize is going to vary throughout the annual training program. I was going to say macro cycle, so it's going to vary throughout the annual training program. So in certain parts of the year, so particularly early in the preparatory phase, we're going to emphasize physical training. It's going to be a very general physical training, right? The athlete may do some cardiovascular work, so they may be out doing some longer distance runs. They're doing some kind of general weightlifting, squats, bench press, deadlift, that kind of stuff. But then as we get closer to the sports season, now we start working on their technique a little bit more. So as we get into the preseason, we start focusing on things like tackling technique or like blocking technique, to stick with football. And then once we've worked on their blocking technique, then we work into the tactics. All right. So based on your ability to pass block, now we're going to be able to run these certain sets of plays. Or your inability to pass block, if you're not very good, well, now we have a harder time running deeper pass routes, those kinds of things that would require more time for the quarterback. The emphases also change again based on the athlete's training age. So how many years they've spent training. The fewer years that they've spent involved in physical training, in sport training, or involved in sport, the more time they're going to spend on physical training. So the younger the athlete's training age, the less experience that they have, the more time we want them to spend on physical training, kind of, again, preparing that base, right? So establishing a certain level of muscular strength, muscular endurance, etc. It also depends on the athlete's biological age. So again, that is with respect to both chronology, so how old they are, are they 10 or are they 14, but also with respect to puberty. Are they pre-puberty or post? Because post-puberty, we can do some different things with them, right? Their growth plates are going to be a little bit more stable as they get older. They're more 16, 17, 18. We can do some different stuff with them. They can probably withstand a higher training load. But because they've got, again, sticking with that, more solid bones and growth plates that are a little bit less susceptible to injury, they can do different things. So where I was going with this analogy was once they get to 16 years old, now they can start to throw curveballs in baseball, whereas when they're younger, especially pre-puberty, they spend most of their time just trying to locate the fastball, because that change in forearm position between a fastball and a curveball affects the stability of the elbow. And so as they develop and go through puberty, then they can do different things. And again, they can also endure higher training loads, higher intensity, higher volume, that kind of stuff. And obviously it depends on the sport being trained for. Some sports require greater levels of physical strength, physical training than others do in order to just be able to perform the sport. So here I'm thinking about things like gymnastics. If you're looking at a men's gymnast being able to do something like the iron cross or some of the really advanced moves on the rings or on the horse, obviously that requires a pretty spectacular amount of strength and a pretty spectacular amount of body control. And so they're going to have to spend even more time involved in physical training and possibly a little bit less time based on or involved in tactical training, for example. All right, so with physical training then, so preparing the base of the pyramid, there's two main goals. The first is to improve their physiological potential, so to increase their strength, to increase their power. So we're trying to improve, to stick with the terminology that the authors have used so much, we're trying to improve their biomotor abilities, right? So that would fall under improving their physiological potential. We're trying to make them faster, stronger, more powerful, that kind of stuff. And then the other thing is we're trying to then maximize them. So I guess the way that they were using this in terms of improving physiological potential is that, for example, with repeated sprint training, we've talked about that the athlete will store more glycogen. Because they can store more glycogen, they can run faster for longer. And so then because of that, that's going to then improve their muscular endurance, right? So the two feed into each other. In terms of physical training, so it's broken down into two parts, and as you can see there, both of them are in the preparatory phase. And just as an additional review, the three big parts of the annual training plan: preparatory phase, competitive phase, and then the transition phase. So the preparatory phase, again, a more colloquial term for it, although the authors don't like it, but a more colloquial term for that is the off-season, or the preseason is kind of another way of thinking about it. So the preparatory phase, early in the preparatory phase, you have the general physical training aspect. So that's general preparatory phase is another way you'll see that referred to even in this book. So general physical training is training where the athlete is just doing things to improve basic fitness, right? So again, they may be involved in some endurance running. So maybe you've got a soccer player or basketball player, and they're just going out for a 3, 5, 6 mile run, whatever it is, right? So it's very general physical training. It's going to improve their aerobic capacity, potentially a little bit, potentially improve their lactate threshold a little bit. Some of those things that'll be useful for them during basketball season, but we're just kind of working on general fitness in that sense. So they're not training hard, they're just kind of going out for a run, right? And then they're probably doing some pretty basic stuff in the weight room. So they're doing, squats, bench press, deadlift, cleans, maybe, probably not. But you ideally start doing the Olympic variants a little bit closer to the season. Pull-ups, abs, that kind of stuff, right? So that's all part of the general physical training. In that section, or in that phase, athletes are typically going to do sets of somewhere between like 8 and 12 reps. So this is kind of like that hypertrophy, early strength sort of phase to make some connections to what I talked about last time related to the periodization model. So you'd have them involved in doing sets and reps, so intensity and volume, that are related to increasing muscular size, so hypertrophy, and increasing basic muscular strength. And then, as we get closer to the season, now we're going to start to do some sport-specific physical training. And so sport-specific physical training, basically what we do is we move from being very general, like we're trying to just improve your leg strength, to we're trying to improve your leg strength to help you be a better basketball player. And so, for example, things that we want to look at, as we get closer to the season, we want to mimic the movements of sport. We want to have our programs reflect the bioenergetic needs of the sport. And then we also want to have our athletes, and this relates to the movement, but to move at the speed of sport, right? So if you go and do a bunch of squats, well, that's great. You're going to increase your leg strength. But we move a lot faster during a maximal sprint, in basketball and soccer, etc., than we do when we're doing a fairly heavy squat, right? Those are slow movements. So as we get closer to the sport, we have exercises that more closely mimic the movements of the sport, and then again, we're going to try to mimic the bioenergetic demands of the sport. So as examples, if we're training a basketball player, that's my little reminder down there, my Longhorn basketball player. If we're training a basketball player, early in the general preparatory phase or general physical training phase, we might have them do back squats. Then maybe we transition to front squats, moderate intensity, relatively high volume, like 3 sets of 8 to 10. And then as we get closer to the season, now we're going to have them do something like power cleans. And the idea there, and so power cleans, they're going to do sets of 5 or less. They're going to get a little bit heavier. So we're more into that strength power phase. But when they're doing power cleans, the idea of transitioning from a front squat to a power clean is that the pull phases in the power cleans more closely approximate a jump for a rebound than a front squat does, right? So we're trying to more closely mimic the movements of the sport. And then, as we get really close to the season, maybe we start to do jump squats with the trap bar or with the hex bar, whatever you want to call that thing, for sets of like 1 to 3. So again, we're moving toward exercises that mimic what they're actually going to do in the sport. So we move from front squats to strengthen the legs to power cleans that emphasize that triple extension at the hips, knees, and ankles that they're going to use whenever they jump up for a rebound, and then we actually have them jump, right? So with our trap bars. Another thing that you see sometimes in basketball training, so at least at the Division I level, it's been a full year since I've been to a Division III game, so I don't remember how the setup worked, but with Division I basketball, there are timeouts, media timeouts every 4 minutes. And so one of the things that we can do is to set up the program to mimic that. So with that setup where you've got 4 minutes of work, 60 seconds, maybe 30 seconds of rest, built into the structure of the game, you could structure your workouts in the same way, where you have the athletes doing some combination of forward sprinting, lateral movement, backwards running, those kinds of things, where they're working to reflect the energy demand of the sport for those 4 minutes, where there's a sprint, there's a little bit of recovery time, like some walking, because obviously you're doing that during a basketball game. There's some recovery time built in when you move from one end of the court to the other. And so you do that consecutively for 4 minutes, and then you have a 30 or 60 second rest, and then you repeat it again. Do that 5 times, and then you're through the half, right? So that would be a really specific way of structuring that program. And so again, the goal with something like that would be to, if you're doing some combination of sprinting and lateral movement, that kind of stuff, to mimic both the energetic demands of the sport, because again, you're sprinting, resting, but also the movement demands of the sport by incorporating both sagittal plane movement. So remember, way back in structure, I told you that moving forward and backwards is sometimes referred to as sagittal plane movement. So you're doing, running forwards and backwards, and then also frontal plane or coronal movement, so moving laterally. So the overarching theme there then is that we move in our program design from being really non-specific, general gym activities, general conditioning, to being something very specific. So another example would be, to stick with basketball, you'd have this progression potentially from bench press to one-arm dumbbell press to one-arm cable press, because obviously you're not playing basketball lying down, and so you would want to do movements later in the program that mimic the demands of the sport. So for example, like, one arm, push pass kind of a thing. So we would then have them do cable type motion so they could mimic that and incorporate both the lower body, the core, and the upper body in that training movement. In terms of the last bullet point on there, that overlap may hamper performance, one of the things that the authors go to great lengths to point out, and I don't know how much this belief is still true, but there often among coaches is this belief that engaging in low intensity endurance exercise, so jogging or running for a mile or more, that benefits every sport, right? And so I mentioned last time or the time before about how if you were a strength and power athlete, like a volleyball player, like a football offensive lineman, like a weightlifter, power lifter, etc., how doing that kind of low intensity endurance exercise is actually a different motor unit recruitment pattern than what you would use in your sport, and can actually hamper performance by sort of changing the neuromuscular adaptations you've already made. And so the point of that last bullet there is to say that not all of your athletes are going to be able to benefit from that low intensity endurance exercise. We don't need to necessarily have our baseball pitchers go in and spend a bunch of time on the bike, or we don't need to have them go and run lots and lots of poles, for example, because those aren't the energy systems that they use in the course of their sport, right? So for an athlete like that, more interval sprinting might be more appropriate, because again, it mimics the use of it mimics the metabolic needs of the sport, but also to a closer extent mimics the movement needs of the sport, because you're moving a little bit faster than you would obviously doing jogging or slow running. So don't make all your athletes run miles. Many of them won't benefit from that. Now, if we're talking soccer player, basketball player, those interval sprint sports, certainly there's some benefit to them. But again, your sprint power athletes, you're not helping them by having them run a bunch of miles. All right. So they do, in this text, define exercise for some reason. But the top bullet point there, and I touched on this in one of the previous lectures where I had a picture of Thor deadlifting 1,100 pounds. The idea that maximizing adaptations requires not only specialization, but also years of training. And so it probably requires somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 years of training. A number I've heard thrown around a lot is that it takes about 10 years to maximize your physiological potential. So it takes a while. You're not just going to go train for a year or two and then reach peak performance. It's going to take years of sustained training, years of incremental growth to finally get to the best performance that you can achieve. So the definition there of an exercise, a motor act, so a movement, used to target physiological adaptations, movement patterns, or muscle groups related to the performance of an athletic skill. So they then describe two broad categories of exercises. So you've got exercises for general physical development, so general muscular strength, for example. So again, things like squats, it's my go-to, leg press, deadlift, bench press, those kinds of things. General stuff for flexibility, kind of a total body stretching program, maybe some foam rolling, falls into the mobility. For general aerobic fitness, running, maybe having them do like the bike, that kind of stuff. And then we've got exercises for the specific needs of their sport. So again, we always start this with an analysis of what does this athlete have to do during their sport? How do they move? What are the energy systems that they're going to use? And that analysis could include things like different types of muscle action. So hopefully you'll remember the three different types of muscle action, where you've got concentric muscle contraction, the muscle contracts and shortens; eccentric, the muscle contracts but lengthens; and then isometric, the muscle contracts but doesn't change length and doesn't move the joint. So the isometric contractions then are your stabilizing contractions. So, for example, if we're doing something like training a baseball pitcher, we might do something like, general stuff, again, sticking with upper body stuff, bench press, dumbbell press, maybe military press. They're oftentimes hesitant to do overhead stuff, but bench press, dumbbell press, lat pull downs, that kind of stuff. So again, very general exercises there. And then we'll have them do some rotator cuff stuff, right, with the exercise bands, or TheraBands is a brand name. but you can have them do different internal, external rotation of the shoulder to work on the strength of the rotator cuff. And then as we get really close to the season, again, one of the things that pitchers are going to have to do, and one of the things that tends to cause injury in baseball pitchers in their shoulders, is after they release the ball, they have to slow their arm down. And so you get these big eccentric, contracting but lengthening, contractions of the external rotator muscles, so of infraspinatus and teres minor. And so what we can do is we've already built that strength by doing some of our basic pressing and pulling exercises. Then we've done some more specific stuff for the rotator cuff with the bands. And then right before the season, we can do things like have weighted balls. So about the size of a baseball, but they may weigh 6 ounces instead of 5. And basically you toss it over their shoulder and have them catch it and decelerate it, or catch it and slow it down, right? And so now we're mimicking the action that they perform during a baseball pitch. So that way we can train that movement. We're adding a little bit of weight, so we're overloading it some, right? So that's one of the ways that we would actually train a specific muscle action that they use in their sport. RFD stands for rate of force development. So again, we want to, particularly close to the sport season, have them move at the speed of sport. So that goes in with the example I was talking about earlier with having our basketball player do jump squats. Velocity characteristics of the sport, so being able to speed up, slow down, change direction, all that kind of stuff. Let me try to make sure I don't have anything else in my notes here. Nope. Okay, good. All right. So technical training. So again, technical training is working on performing the actual movements of the sport, being able to throw the ball accurately, being able to block somebody if you're an offensive lineman, being able to get off a block if you're a defensive lineman, that kind of stuff. That's all technical training. So we want the movement to be biomechanically sound. So what we're looking for then is that they are doing movements that are not going to be injurious, right? And so some of the things that athletes will do that are not biomechanically sound. So sometimes you'll see really younger competitive lifters. So I see this, or I used to see this when I would judge high school powerlifting. You get kids that weren't taught very well. And basically they would start the deadlift with the bar a few inches in front of their shins, so it wasn't actually touching them. And so the first thing they would do when they started the lift was to actually round their back, right? Especially in the thoracic spine. And so that then lengthens some of those spine stabilizer muscles. That's not what we want. So that's not something that's biomechanically sound. They're putting themselves in an injurious position. So we want to avoid that. But the other thing is that those movements that are biomechanically sound tend to be more efficient. And so more efficient in this sense means a lower energy requirement. And so to stick with the deadlift example, hopefully you'll have taken biomechanics or have some understanding of torque. But to stick with the deadlift example, the farther the bar is from the axis of rotation, so if the bar isn't touching your shins, it's 6 inches out in front of your shins or out in front of your body, it's farther from the axis of rotation, which in that case is primarily the hips, the low back area, but let's call it the hips. That bar exerts then a greater turning force. It's actually going to be harder to lift. The closer we can get that bar, the weight, to the axis of rotation, the more we're going to reduce its torque, the turning force that it produces, and so the easier it's going to be to lift, so it's actually going to cost less energy to do it. And so if we're trying to max out, we want to use as little energy as possible because we're going to use a lot to perform this lift, so we don't want to make ourselves work any harder than we have to. And the more efficient the exercise is, or the more efficient the movement is, so we use less energy, the more effective it tends to be. So classic example there, and this becomes really, really important with endurance exercise. So things like cross-country running, the less energy you spend to run at a given speed, the less lactate you're likely to accumulate, so you can probably run faster for longer, right? And so that's the concept of running economy. So running economy is how much oxygen you consume to run at a given speed. And so, like this lady here, I stole this from Google, I didn't make that, although the WTF I thought was pretty funny. But if you look at her right leg there, so what she's doing every time she pushes off is she's actually internally rotating her hip, probably to get clearance of the ground for her foot. And you can also see on her left side, that her left hip, when she's striking the ground, her foot is actually kind of facing us, right? So her left hip is internally rotated. So what she's getting on each stride is a lot more hip internal and external rotation than is really necessary. And so all of that movement then costs energy, right? And so it makes the energy demands to run higher, which is cool if you're trying to burn calories. But if we're an elite athlete, or if we're trying to be, we want to burn as few calories as possible doing those things, or to expend as little energy as possible during that run. And so why that matters. So if we've got somebody who is a trained athlete against an untrained athlete, so we'll call her untrained. If there's somebody running next to her that had a really efficient running gait, then they're going to be consuming 20 to 30%, maybe even more, or sorry, maybe even less, 20 to 30% less oxygen to run at the same speed. So even though they're both running, let's say 7 miles an hour, the trained runner is consuming less oxygen to do that. So that means they've got a higher ceiling. They're producing less lactate. They can run even faster, and they can run faster for longer, right? So that's why the efficiency aspect becomes important. As far as technique and style, so one of the things that we'll do in terms of especially teaching new movements is obviously we tend to break them down. So technique and style tend to build on each other. Technique is kind of how the movement is performed, and style is how this individual performs it. But so for example, with things like, the snatch, so if we're starting to teach the Olympic lifts, the snatch is where the bar comes off the ground, straight up overhead with the arms fully extended. That's the gist of the snatch. And so that's a pretty complex movement, because you have to be able to come up off the ground, so you have to be able to extend the hips and the knees at the same time that you're shrugging your shoulders, at the same time that you're abducting and slightly extending the shoulders and flexing the elbows, and then you have to flip everything, right? So you have to then abduct, externally rotate at the shoulders, you have to then drop into flexion at the hip. So there's a lot going on there. And so to teach that movement, we usually break it down into different parts. And I say we, like I'm not particularly good at teaching the Olympic lifts, but when it's done, it's usually broken down into some constituents of, like, maybe you start with the bar at the hips with that grip where your hands are out by the collars, the snatch grip. And so you start with the bar at the hips and then flip it overhead from the hips. And then once you're okay flipping it overhead from the hips, now maybe you drop it down to mid-thigh and then down below your knee. And then once you're okay doing that, then you do some iteration of starting with the bar behind your neck and falling underneath it and catching it. And then you kind of put those things together, right? So that's where the technique stuff goes in. In terms of, I'm trying to make sure I didn't skip a page, because I think I did. When I flipped my notes here, yeah, I did. There we go. So in terms of individual style, though, so that was teaching the technique. That's how you do a snatch. But there is some variation in individual style. So for example, if we're thinking about something like powerlifting, if you've ever watched powerlifting, the 3 competitive lifts are squat, back squat, bench press, and deadlift. And so you'll see some variation in the squat. Some people stand super wide, because the primary rule in the squat is that the hip has to drop below the knee, right? That's the primary way you're judged there. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the big thing the judges are looking at. And so for some people, they're able to do that pretty effectively and pretty comfortably if they stand really wide with their toes pointed out. Other people do a much more athletic type squat where their feet are up under their shoulders and their toes are turned out just slightly. Some people have flat shoes. Some people have shoes with a little bit of a heel. And similarly, you'll see some people where they have their hands all the way at the collar. Some people, like, their hands are just off their shoulders. So that's their style. So they're still, all of them are squatting, but they're just doing it in slightly different ways that are more efficient for them or more effective for them based on their body build. And so that's their individual style. So as long as it's not injurious, we're not super concerned about it. In terms of learning and skill formation, so the gist of it is that's usually broken down into 3 basic parts, where it's a 3-part process. In the first part, essentially what you're going to do is explain the movement. Here's the goal of it. Here's how we do it. And then you'll have the athlete watch someone do it, usually you as the coach, so they're observing it. And then in part 2, they're going to try to actually perform the skill. They're going to refine the skill. And then once they can do it and do it well, then the third phase of learning and skill formation is to have them be able to do it consistently. So it is watch and observe is step one, perform and perform it well is step two, and then perform it well consistently is step three. In terms of the evolutional character of technique, so as a sport historian, I appreciate that they threw this one in here, but the technique obviously changes over the course of time. So for example, I don't know if you've ever seen any of the old videos of baseball pitchers. I was trying to find one on YouTube, but I couldn't find any good short clips. But sometimes the pitchers, from the 1940s, 50s, and then even earlier, will do this like really long windup where they start with the ball in their glove, and then they bring their hands and their both hands, the ball and the glove behind their back, and then they come way up over their head, and then they have a really high leg kick, and then they throw, right? And so there's this really big, protracted windup. You don't see that much anymore. Like the way that movement is taught now is much more compact because it's much more efficient. And so the way things are performed changes over time. The classic example, which I think is one the book gives, is the way that the high jump has changed over time, where the Fosbury flop revolutionized the sport, right? So some of this stuff does change across time. What becomes more effective changes. And we also see that, just thinking about, because as I'm recording this, like the NBA playoffs are going on, and the way that basketball has changed, where the three-pointer is so much more of a big deal, so much more of a feature in the professional game than it used to be, right? And so it's just a change in the way athletes train and the way that the tactics of the sport have changed as well. Speaking of tactics, so a couple terms associated with tactics. The first one there is strategy. And the way of thinking about strategy is kind of just as this overarching philosophy. So classic example here is the University of Nebraska. Back in their heyday, back when they were good at football and not terrible like they are now, but back in their heyday, their identity, if you will, was that they were a ball control team that just pounded the ball using an I formation, right? And so the idea, the overall strategy is to hang on to the ball as long as possible, because if we have the ball, they can't score, right? And so by running the football, you run the clock, so then that maximizes your time of possession. And again, the more time you have the ball, the less time they have to score. And so that's the overall strategy there. And so then, so the strategy is to win by minimizing the opponent's opportunities to score. And then the tactics are, how do we actually mechanically go about doing that? Well, one, we're going to run the ball. And two, if we really want to maximize the amount of time that we have the ball, what we're going to try to do is actually to gain 4 yards per play, right? So if we just 4 yards on first down, 4 yards on second down, 4 yards on third down, boom, that's a first down. That ate up a whole bunch of time, because if they have big explosive plays where they go 80 yards in one play, then they're not hanging on to the ball anymore. So if you're just getting little chunks of yardage, enough that you can keep moving the chains and keep getting first downs, well then you're going to hang on to the ball longer, right? And so then that fulfills your overall strategy. So the tactics are the plays that you run in order to achieve the overall strategy. And there's other things that you can do other than running particular plays. But that's, I think, if you're familiar with football, I think that's a kind of an easy way to conceptualize that. So the athletes are going to do tactical training during the season. So that is a way to think about tactical training is running plays. So again, sticking with the football example, we're going to run through. These are our blocking assignments. The receivers are going to be here, all that kind of stuff. So tactical training then includes like the strategic elements of the sport. So, for example, if they are running a particular, so again with football, if you're on offense, if the defense is running a particular coverage, well, we know that the hole is going to be, or the hole in the coverage is going to be in the middle of the field between the hash marks. So teaching the quarterback to recognize that, teaching the receivers to recognize that based on this alignment of the defense, we can be pretty sure the open spot in the field will be right here in the middle, or, off to the sides but close, out on the flat. That kind of stuff. Those are the strategic elements of the sport. It would include studying the rules and regulations of the sport, which, as I was thinking about this and kind of going over the notes, before starting this lecture, one of the things that I was reminded of was from the 2020 NFL season, and sorry to have so many football examples, but the Dallas Cowboys were losing to the Atlanta Falcons, and you can Google this pretty easily, but they're losing to the Atlanta Falcons with less than 2 minutes left in the game, and so the Cowboys go for this an onside kick to try to get the ball back, which is a play with a pretty low success rate. But what happened there is they kick the ball, and the ball has to go 10 yards in order for the kicking team to touch it. But the receiving team can touch it at any point. And so basically the Falcons didn't understand that. They didn't know that they could have just jumped on the ball, and so they waited till it went 10 yards and the Cowboys got it, right? And so in that instance, the players weren't coached up, didn't understand, didn't remember probably the rules of the game, that they could have touched the ball, and so they misunderstood, and so that resulted in the Cowboys getting the ball back and actually winning the game. So tactical training includes like going over some of those basics of the rules of here's the formations we can run, here are the types of screens you can set, here's what makes an illegal screen, that kind of stuff. Evaluating the abilities of best athletes. So for example, I know, sorry, another football example, but it's in my notes. If I was on a real football jag when I was writing this one, if we're an offensive lineman, or if we're coaching offensive linemen, maybe you look at what it is that David Bakhtiari does that makes him a really successful left tackle. How does he block? How does he move? That kind of stuff. Obviously, tactical training includes researching the strategies of opponents, aka film study. I'm sure all of you do that as part of your various sports. So, what is it that I can expect the competition to do? And that also includes, that self-analysis too, of watching yourself on film and, okay, where is it that I could improve? Where are my technical abilities lacking? Why was I not successful on that play? That kind of stuff. Other things, evaluating the competition or the facilities. So that would be particularly important if you're somebody like a golfer, maybe a cross-country runner. So you're looking at, what's the course look like? Where am I running? Or what holes are particularly challenging? That kind of things, or those kind of things. And then analyzing past performance. So again, that sort of self-reflection, that self-film study of what are my tendencies? Where is my technique lacking? That kind of stuff. All right. So other things we could have them work on. So the uniform distribution of energy. So that's the idea that they're able to maintain tactical proficiency even under conditions of fatigue, because it's the whole, and you've probably all done this in your own sport training, the whole like fourth quarter thing. In this movie is really dated, but if you ever watched Remember the Titans with Denzel Washington, there's a pretty classic scene where the athletes are doing conditioning, and they're doing old school football conditioning, and they're doing a bunch of up downs, right, where you run in place and the coach blows the whistle and you fall on the ground, kind of flop on the ground, and then you get back up and you run in place again, right? And so they're doing this conditioning, and so Denzel Washington is laying next to this player on the ground, and he just keeps saying fourth quarter. Every time the athlete hits the ground, you just keep saying fourth quarter, fourth quarter, fourth quarter, right? And so it's this idea of fatiguing yourself, or having the athletes be fatigued so that they can perform under similar conditions to what they're going to see in the game. So that may be analogous to second half, third period, however your sport is broken down. But it's that same idea of performing under conditions of fatigue. And so maybe as part of our training, to tie this back to that, what we could do is to induce that fatigue to help prepare them. So maybe we do some pretty lengthy conditioning, and then we have them run plays that they're likely to run at the end of the game. So that way they'll perform them under similar state of mental and physical fatigue, right? In terms of technical solutions to tactical tasks, so you have them perform under less than ideal conditions. I was laughing because so two things. So when I was a high school athlete, one of the things that our coaches used to do to us as football players, because I was a high school football player in Texas, is that our high school had a metal building that the floor of it was just like office carpet. And they had a bunch of heaters in there. And so for most of the off season, so most of the winter training program, we would have to go in there every day in full sweats, and they would have all the heaters blasting, and we would do various drills on the wrestling mat, agility drills, we did monkey bars, we did all kinds of stuff. But we always did it with the heaters blasting or not always, but most of the time we did it with the heaters blasting and in full sweats. And so the coach's idea was to get you used to that heat, to performing, with that heat-induced fatigue. But one of those same coaches actually became my boss. So after I finished college, my first job out of college, or I guess second job out of college, out of undergrad, was working as a high school teacher and coach. And so one of those coaches, the guy who used to run the hardest drills, was the athletic director at a nearby school. And so he hired me to be a football coach and basketball coach and a number of other things that you've heard me talk about. But during one particular off-season training session, one year, so one of the drills they used to make the kids do, it was not my idea, but one of the drills they used to make the kids do is there was a telephone pole out there on the ground outside of the weight room. And so the players would have to do bear crawls the length of this telephone pole. There's actually two of them. So you have to do bear crawl down and then bear crawl back the other one. And then you had to do various things where you had to like cross one hand over, cross the other hand over, cross your feet over, go sideways, all kinds of dumb stuff like that. One year though, there was an ice storm. And so like the ground all around those telephone poles, the players had kind of worn ruts around on either side of the poles. And so that those ruts filled up with ice. So that coach made the athletes go out there on the ice, because that was an adverse condition. And so basically, if you can deal with that, if you can deal with how much this sucks, it's going to increase your mental toughness. And so you'll be able to translate that from January to next September when we're playing, right? And so you had them perform under these adverse conditions. And then the next year, which was the year before I got there wasn't an ice storm. And the coach was really excited about having done that really arduous training the year before. And so the year that there wasn't an ice storm, when there was supposed to be, he actually emptied out the ice machine and like just dumped cubed ice all the way around the telephone poles on either side, and then made the athletes do bear crawls over those. So again, he's trying to, not the most effective way, but he was trying to induce those less than ideal conditions in his mind to sort of foster that mental resilience, that mental toughness that they would need in their sport. So I would say be a little smarter than that about it, but there are certain times where you can induce, artificial conditions. Classic example here is you have a bunch of really loud music playing. If you're going to go into another team's stadium, it's going to be really loud, right? So you're inducing that sort of adverse condition that you're going to expect. Or if it's at the end of the week, you're going to play in freezing rain, and it's also freezing rain on Monday, well, you don't practice inside. You go practice outside, and it's going to suck, but it's going to help you prepare for how it's going to be, that weekend, that kind of thing. Other things, maximize teammate cooperation. So we can do that through small-sided games. So small-sided games are where you've got a reduced area of the court or the field, and you maybe only have like 3 or 4 players. So rather, for soccer, rather than playing 11 on 11, you play like 4 on 4 in a quarter of the field. And so the idea there, one of the ideas there, is that it forces every athlete to touch the ball a little bit more. So that's good. There's less running. There's more ball handling. But it can then also, it fosters a little bit different style of play, more passing, more agility, that kind of stuff. So we can do that. So by having those teammates in closer contact like that, we can foster some of that cooperation, the willingness to pass. But another thing that fosters that is just having your teammates like each other, or your athletes like each other. And so through different sorts of outings or tournaments, particularly with youth athletes, it's interesting how much their play changes after they go to a tournament. Because they're around each other, away from the court or away from the ice, and so they become friends with their teammates. And so as a result of that, they're more willing to pass to all their teammates. So that's one thing there. And then perfecting the team's flexibility. So you can throw the unexpected at them, the old sudden change, right? So maybe that's change in the schedule. Like you have something that wasn't on the pregame plan, or maybe that is running a variety of different offenses or defenses at them, things that they didn't expect to see, and just see how they adjust. So you might have told them that the team you're going to play this week runs a particular defense, and then you just throw a different one at them just to see if they can adjust on the fly, see if they can kind of extrapolate some of the basic principles to this defense they haven't seen before. So in terms of the game plan, so this stuff's pretty common sense. So the game plan, the preliminary plan is based on watching game film of your opponent, what you think they're going to do. Based on what you think they're going to do, you're going to come up with a plan of how you're going to attack that defense or how you're going to attack that offense. That's your preliminary plan. And then you apply it through scout team type drills, and then you analyze, well, how well did that work? And you do the same thing over the course of the actual game. So that's kind of in the lead up to the game. Maybe you tinker with the strategy just a little bit based on how things went with your scout team, and then depending on how the game turns out, you analyze that and see if things turned out as you expected. The coach on there, his name is Tom Osborne. He was the coach of Nebraska back when they were in their most recent heyday, back when they were running the I formation option stuff. And so one of the things that he was famous for as a coach was giving his quarterbacks quizzes every week. And so what he would do is, run through the game plan and explain, okay, here are the basics. If they run these defenses, these are the kind of plays you're going to want to run. And then he actually had them do a written quiz every week, and they had to be able to pass the quiz in order to be able to practice. So it's kind of a cool idea. It takes a lot of effort on his part, but it was an interesting idea, and so that was something that he did consistently, and so the athletes knew to expect it. All right. So in terms of maximizing the athlete's performance, so between perfecting technique and then their tactical training, there are some conflicting concepts that you're going to run up against. So integration, differentiation. So integration, we're putting things together. Differentiation, we're taking things apart. So the idea there is that your new learners are going to build up. So we start with a simple part of the skill. So to go back to the old teaching the Olympic lift example, like I said, new learners build up. So we have them do high pulls from the hip, from the thigh, from the knee, and then catches. So we're building up. We're starting with a basic block of the movement, and then we're adding pieces to it to make it more closely resemble the actual competitive movement. And then your more advanced athletes, we're going to have to break things down. So if they missed a lift, then we're going to go back through and watch the film and say, okay, well, maybe you pulled too hard on the left, or whatever the actual technical breakdown was. So the more advanced athletes, we look for, now that you can do it, where are some flaws in that technique? New learners, we're just trying to build it up. In terms of stability versus variability, I talked about this a little bit last time. So when we set up a training program, there are certain outcomes we're looking to achieve, whether that's muscular growth, strength, power, etc. And we probably have certain exercises that are pretty good at facilitating those adaptations. But if we do those all the time, the athletes are going to get bored, right? So that's too much stability. So we have to introduce some variability, but again, it's a happy medium. If you change things every single week, you're probably not going to foster the adaptations that you want. And then standardization versus individualization. Standardization is basically how it should be done. Here's what a baseball pitch looks like. Individualization is this athlete does a baseball pitch, but they have maybe a high leg kick, right? So there's some guys like Bronson Arroyo. I don't know if he's still hanging around in the majors, but Bronson Arroyo, who used to pitch for the Reds, would have this really high leg kick, and he'd fully extend his knee and all that sort of thing. And so that was his style, but he was still an effective pitcher, right? So there's a how it should be done to maximize efficiency, and there's a, well, this is how this athlete does it, and they're still pretty effective, so we'll just let them do it. In terms of the stages of perfecting the technique, so this is a pretty useful little diagram there. But in stage one, the primary objective is to perfect the individual components of the movement. So kind of what I was talking about there with using the snatch example, have them be able to do some from the hip, some from below the knee, be able to catch it, that kind of stuff. And then stage 2, we're actually going to have them do the whole thing. So they're going to do the full snatch. And then stage 3 is being able to do that consistently. So whenever they first are able to perform a snatch, they'll be able to do it, here and there, but they're going to miss some, they're going to pull too hard, they're going to not be able to catch it, whatever it is. And so stage 3 is just being able to repeat that. So stage 3 is repeatability. It's kind of a way to think about it. In terms of correcting any errors, so there's generally 3 categories of errors so if the athlete isn't able to get, isn't able to accomplish the lift, isn't able to perform the play, there's generally three categories that could be going wrong. So first is that they're just doing it wrong, right? So maybe they're not strong enough. That's an improper physiological base. They're just not strong enough to perform it. Or they don't, they just can't, right? We'll go with not strong enough. That's probably the easiest way to think about that. Or they were taught improperly, or there's some sort of a psychological aspect to it. Maybe the way the coach taught them, there were some technical faults there. So maybe the coach used inappropriate teaching methods. So to go back to the snatch example, maybe they didn't break it down quite enough. Like they went straight from the floor and were like, all right, just throw this overhead and catch it, right? And so, because the athletes can kind of do it, but they wouldn't be able to do it well. And so that would be a teaching method issue of just kind of throwing the whole movement at them and seeing if they can do it. It's not the most effective way to teach that. And then other things, equipment or organizational or environmental causes. So, maybe you've got an athlete who has a problem where when they're batting in let's say softball, the bat drops too low when they swing every time. And so maybe the reason for that is actually that the bat's too heavy for them, right? And so that's actually kind of 2 things there. 1, the athlete's performing it incorrectly because bat's too heavy, so they're not strong enough. But 2, the equipment itself is faulty in that it's too heavy for them, right? So if we swap out the equipment, they're strong enough for the lighter equipment, they'll be able to perform the move correctly. And then the last thing, so we talked about theoretical stuff previously, I think 2 times ago. But theoretical stuff is kind of the why. So why are we doing these things? When we, I was trying to think of like football stuff again, sorry, but when we think of we're going to run this particular formation, well, we have to have these linemen here, can't have that guy over there because of the rules of the game. In terms of why we want the athlete to perform a movement in a certain way, you can explain the biomechanics of it. You can explain things like running economy, efficiency of movement. In terms of the planning of their training, so that's one thing actually oftentimes as coaches, we can fall short, is not being able to explain our rationale for our program design. So why are you having me do this thing? Well, I'm trying to improve your lactate tolerance, right? Or lactate turnover. I'm trying to increase your muscular strength. I'm trying to increase your muscular power, whatever it is. But you should be able to explain why it is that you're doing something. And actually, that's a big part of the program design project that I want you to do. Is I want you to be able to explain, rationalize your program. You've laid it out. Here is the best program you think for this hypothetical athlete. Now tell me why, as if you were explaining to the athlete. And then we talked about the psychological and nutritional aspects before. You're not around the athlete all the time, so have them understand the why of why refueling is important, why it's important that they eat 3 to 4 hours before competition, that kind of stuff. All right, and that's the end of like I said, what is basically the coaching chapter. So we'll move on to chapter 4 next time.